This year is the Queen's Jubilee in the UK, and I've been hearing a lot of different thoughts about it and a lot of opinions, and actually mostly negative. And I asked myself, how do I feel about the Queen's Jubilee? And I would describe myself as an Irish Republican for the simple reason that I would like to see a 32 county United Ireland as a republic in this country, something that hasn't been the case for over 800 years, mostly due to the British occupation of Ireland for 700 years, and then the previous 100 years you have the 6 counties are the occupied territories, which are still, we anticipate a United Ireland will evolve from that at some point. When Michael Collins signed the treaty in 1922, which is exactly 100 years ago, there was provision for a boundary commission so that those 6 counties would be reviewed over time, and the expectation was that some of them, 2 or 3, would be absorbed into the Free State as it was, and then over time it would be an inevitability that the others would join a United Ireland. And that was not to be. So far it's taken 100 years and we still have this partition. So that's my background, and I suppose I've had that position since I was my youngest memories as a child was of learning about the Irish history, and my ancestors, my grandfather and great-grandfather, would have fought in the War of Independence in West Cork and would have been involved in the old IRA activities, which would have been ending that 700-year rule by the British in West Cork particularly. And it's interesting now that 100 years later, a lot of those archives are coming out now, and especially at the 100-year anniversary of Michael Collins' death, which is coming up in this August 2022. So all of this is kind of surfacing, and in parallel we have the Queen's Jubilee year, which is 75 years in power, and most of the coverage and most of the, I suppose, just to my credentials as an Irish Republican would be that, so I've had many generations of ancestors who have fought in this struggle for Irish freedom for many generations, and in my case it's purely a peaceful one, thankfully, and it's an aspiration, and it's something that thankfully we live in a time of peace now, which hasn't always been the case. When I was growing up, the troubles in the 6 counties were very alive, but then in 1993 the Good Friday Agreement and the ceasefire ended all of that, and it's been incredibly peaceful since, thankfully. And I would support that peaceful aim towards a United Ireland, and that has borne fruit, and it's been incredibly successful. And the Good Friday Agreement is something, that model that we have for running the 6 counties now and finding a resolution to a conflict is incredibly successful. It's been borne fruit now for 30 years. And it's something that really should be brought around the world to other conflict resolutions. And it's surprising that it hasn't, because there's a lot of potential there. So that would be my political stance: to achieve United Ireland by peaceful means, through negotiation and politics, and through persuasion, and by paving the way, certainly in terms of economics, and in terms of just accepting everybody and making sure that everybody has equal parity of esteem in a United Ireland. And I think that is an inevitability, and I'm going to do a separate video on that, because I believe there will be a United Ireland now within 10 years. I believe it'll be United Ireland by 2030, and the assembly elections in the 6 counties, where the nationalist representatives overtook the Unionists for the very first time in 100 years of the existence of that state. And once that, people talked about it in musical chairs, but really it's the opposite. Once that flipped at all, then it's a permanent change. That will never go back, I believe. So it's inexorable now that we're on the path towards a united Ireland. And it's just a matter of making sure that that's done in a peaceful way and in a way that respects everybody's interests. So in the meantime, we have the Queen's Jubilee, and almost the trend now, the mob, seems to have adopted the attitude that it is something not to be celebrated, something to be ashamed of, or to be objected to. And surprisingly, I would find myself disagreeing with that for a number of reasons. But it shouldn't be surprising, and I think, because I think it's possible for two things to be true at once. It's possible to strive for a united Ireland, a free, independent republic, a united 32 county Ireland to be achieved peacefully, and also for a monarchy to exist in the United Kingdom, side by side. And I think the two are not mutually exclusive. I think it's possible for both. On a very personal level, I find it shocking, really, that some of the bile and hatred that's being directed towards the Queen, who's a 96-year-old woman, and it shows a kind of an immaturity, really, which I think, just in purely personal terms, I think, a 96-year-old woman who has seen and lived through so much, I think a lot of the commentary is very mean-spirited. And I think we can all step back off our high horse, elevated positions in politics and just realise that there's an elderly woman who has remarkably lived through so much and been through so much that she is due a celebration, even just on a purely personal level. There is also the angle that I suspect that she's actually quite a decent, kind person from what I see on the news and so on. And also I think that Kate and William are fantastic ambassadors for the future of that monarchy. And surprisingly, I suppose originally I knew absolutely nothing about the monarchy growing up, apart from that they were this great evil that we had to fight against because they were responsible for all of our problems. Things were quite simple then in terms of republicanism. Things were very black and white, or possibly dark green and white. And when I was growing up, there was never we never saw the Queen on TV, we never saw written about, nothing. We had two channels, and my father was, being an ardent Republican and with all that history of fighting the British in West Cork, refused point blank to have BBC or any foreign channels in the household. So really I knew nothing about the monarchy until later in life. It was William and Kate that, first of all, that piqued my interest in the monarchy, because I find the two of them quite fascinating, really. And Kate is a fantastic addition to that family, I think. And it is just a family, really. And I think the two of them are fantastic ambassadors and would be for any family or any organisation. And I think just the way they are so much in love on a basic level, I think, and I know there's a lot of mean commentary about that as well, but I think on a basic level, they seem to be genuinely in love, and that doesn't cost anything. I don't think that's a privilege. It's something, that's the only true privilege, really, actually, in a way, is love for one another. And I think they have that, a genuine one. And that's the only true privilege, really, that they have. The rest of it is, you couldn't really call it a privilege to be forced into that limelight and live that very contrived life where they're under the spotlight all the time. But to have the basic human need of somebody to love and to create a family with, and by the looks of it, the family are fantastic as well, and they look like a generation of characters for the future as well. So that piqued my interest first, and I knew nothing about. And then something quite shocking and a big milestone. The Queen actually visited Ireland about 10 years ago for the first time in, I think, 100 years that a monarch had visited Ireland. I think it was 1910 or something previously. And that was quite interesting. I'll never forget that visit, because driving along the road into Dublin, so the Cork-Dublin road, I remember coming back, and I would never seen such intense policing in my life, because driving the road, the last 20, 30 kilometres into Baldonnel, which was the military airport where the Queen was coming in, there was a Garda, or a policeman as we call them in Ireland, a Garda every 100 metres, I'd say, or every 200 metres on the road, just standing there watching absolutely everything. And I'd say they probably had a requirement that every Garda had to be able to see one on either side of them, so that there was immediate contact if anything suspicious happened. But nothing happened. And it was an incredibly peaceful visit, and it was a milestone, and it really showed how far we'd got in terms of peace and reconciliation in the country. And the Queen even used some Irish, some Gaeilge, which is more than a lot of Irish people did. She said a chorda, fáilte go gach on shore or something like that. And it's something I find interesting, because I would use a chorda in email sometimes, and I was criticised for doing it, and because people wouldn't understand it. But then, the Queen has used it. If the Queen can use it, I think surely we can. And then, the bit I found most fascinating about it was that the Queen visited Cork. And Cork, the people of Cork gave her the warmest welcome of all. The people lined the streets and were cheering, and she went into the English market and was given fresh fish and all that kind of stuff. And I think it was Cork people deciding, this was the rebel county, which would have fought the hardest against the Queen's forces, but here they were, giving her the biggest welcome of all. And that was fascinating. That was interesting. But now we have the Jubilee, and there's a lot of resentment out there. There's a lot of bile and hatred. And another thing there is a trend towards a despising of any form of tradition. So the monarchy, I'm not necessarily a fan of the monarchy, but I find it something, I believe in tradition, and I think tradition is something that should be preserved. And if there is a monarchy there that has been there for 1,000 years, I believe, or is it 700 AD that it started? It's at least 1,000 years. Then I think it shouldn't be destroyed on a whim. And there is a desire now to just destroy anything traditional or anything connected with the past, and almost erase culture and build it up again, because there's so much desire there to connect everything with offence. And I think nobody could be more offended than me, or the likes of me, who have had family members and ancestors traumatised from the war against the British over the years, and in British imperialism, you could say. So I could, if I liked, be incredibly deeply offended by the Queen and everything she represents. But I think offence these days, and I've done a separate video on it, offence these days has gone completely out of control, and it's become a new form of currency for people. To get offended is something to get social credit, and it's the best thing you can do in the world now in terms of getting credit and social credit and sort of clout, if you like, particularly online. People seem to get offended about absolutely everything. And I think to dredge back into the past and to try and find ways that we could get offended is a pretty reductive exercise, and not particularly useful. And particularly in Ireland, I think, where we've come so far and both sides have compromised so much, I think it's particularly useless. And then people say that the monarchy, the head of state, should be elected. And I find that amusing too. And the assumption is that, if you have an election and you have somebody who's elected, then that will deliver the perfect result. When, of course, it doesn't. Now, democracy is the best, worst system that we have, or whatever the saying might be, but the notion that we'll get somebody who's better simply because they run through a beauty contest and got elected, I don't think it's true. I think we have an elected head of state, a president in Ireland. The president has no power whatsoever. It is a purely ceremonial role and utterly useless, really. And to say that we've got good candidates because they've been elected, I think would be a bit of a joke. I mean, our current president is quite good. I like Michael D. Higgins. I even interviewed him once on Squelga, so I do admire him as a person, but as a professional, there is no profession there. It's a retirement home for failed politicians, really, mostly. So I think this idea that we should tear down our traditional institutions and make them conform to modern traditions just because people might get offended or otherwise, I think is pointless. I would disagree with it. And I suppose tradition is something that should be valued, and there is an awful lot of ancient tradition and valuable tradition in London. I love going to London and visiting the House of Parliament, and the sense of history there in that building is phenomenal, and all of the rituals and so on, and the oldest parliament in the world, and it is an incredible sight to see, and to run that through the Shire, I think would be a real shame. So I think the path to United Ireland is inevitable now. I think it's something that is an inexorable thing, and I don't think the Queen or any of the institutions of that office are standing in the way of that. I think nobody's standing in the way. I think it's a kind of an open goal now. So, but we have, and when the peace process happened in Ireland, it was fascinating that when there was the prospect of peace and the process of resolution, the immediate thing that happened was there was breakaway groups from the paramilitaries, and you had dissidents. And I found it fascinating in that from a psychological point of view, there were people involved in that struggle who couldn't handle the fact that they had achieved their aim, because that largely they did. I mean, you couldn't have achieved more, really. And this could go all the way back towards 1922 when Michael Collins and others signed the treaty. It would have been unimaginable 50 years earlier that Collins would have been able to achieve so much and to get a free Ireland with so much, considering that what had been through and the fact that the Irish army was on its knees at the time and wouldn't have been able to achieve more. But of course there were people who just couldn't handle any concession whatsoever and couldn't handle the fact that victory had been achieved. It's just that type of character will point towards anything, the smallest thing possible that hasn't been achieved, and say we have to rip up the whole lot now because of that. And there's, on a psychological level, it's a fear of success and a resentment almost of it. And I think sometimes when people are involved in a struggle, and there's none more deep than a struggle involving warfare and arms and guerrilla warfare on the street, that sometimes the struggle outweighs the aim. So you have the aim, and then these people are engaged in a struggle in order to meet the aim. But sometimes the aim gets completely disregarded because they're so wrapped up in the struggle and the bitterness and the fighting and the violence. And that, once the struggle is removed, then the aim isn't enough. And we saw that then with the Good Friday Agreement. There were breakaway dissidents who couldn't handle the fact that there was peace, couldn't handle the fact that they had achieved so much. The Good Friday Agreement gave Republicans and Unionists so much. I mean, the ability to vote for a United Ireland when the time came, the ability to, reform the police service to police PSNI, a new parliament where there would be joint power sharing, which was quite unique in the world. In that assembly, there is really no opposition. All the parties joined together and are in coalition government together, which is a brilliant idea, I think, and should probably be done everywhere. But now we have the Queen's 75th anniversary, and it seems to be mocked and full of disdain by most people who resent any form of tradition, who resent the fact that there is a centuries-old tradition of the monarchy, who believe, perhaps misguidedly, that if this person was elected, that there would be some way better, even though it would end that traditional line of hundreds of years. And there are people who direct quite shocking bile and hatred towards a 96-year-old woman, and I don't want to be in that camp. And I wondered, would my ancestors, my grandfather and great-grandfather, be turning in their grave if they felt that I would take that attitude, that I would be happy with the Queen's Jubilee? But then I think no. I think they would. I think if they were alive today, they would be shocked and amazed and delighted at the fact that we've achieved so much, that we've achieved so much freedom in Ireland, that we have the ability now to unite the country within possibly 10 years, that we have our own destiny, and that we are thriving, that we're a pretty economically strong country, and that we've achieved so much. And I think they would be happy. I don't think necessarily they would be outside Buckingham Palace waving a Union Jack, but that's understandable. I think on a very personal level, I think the 96-year-old woman who has seen so much history, seen the death of Diana, and I think dealt with it with dignity, and seen the world wars and lived through it all, and so much pain and hardship, which people would discount because she lives in a palace, but really she's a human being, and I think she's conducted herself well. And I think there's something nice about tradition. I think it's a connection to the past, which we often don't have. And my instinct is to, and I suppose there's the heart and the head, and your heart might say one thing and your head might say something else, but my instinct is to be generous about this and have a sense of goodwill and to wish her the best for this Jubilee year. So there are my thoughts on that. If you have any thoughts and comments, leave them in the comments, and I'll see you next time.